Welcome, everybody, to those of you who are celebrating Passover, Moedim B'Simcha. Have the greeting for the intermediate days of Passover, and I hope that everybody else who was celebrating Easter over the past weekend had a very blessed and joyous holiday. And for those who may be celebrating Easter next weekend, a blessed and meaningful Holy Week to you also. We welcome you. I am Ruth Langer. I am the interim director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning here at Boston College. And we welcome you to the third and last in a series of lunchtime seminars given by Dr. Jesper Svartvik, who is our Corcoran Chair, a visiting scholar for, it's been 2 years now almost. These talks are called, the title of the series is Reading the New Testament Anew, Insights from Jewish Christian Dialogue. And the previous sessions, which are available through our website and on our YouTube channel, were entitled Jesus the Jew and His Christian Followers in February, and then in March, Paul of Tarsus Among Jews and Gentiles. Today's title is the Epistle to the Hebrews, or Against Them. A word about Dr. Svartvik. He holds a doctorate in New Testament Studies from Lund University, where he held the Krister Stendahl Chair of Theology of Religions. His areas of expertise include New Testament studies, interreligious relations in general, and Jewish-Christian relations in particular. Dr. Svartvik is the single author of 12 books and co-editor of 4 more, and more on the way. Most of these books focus on or have significant implications for issues raised by Christian-Jewish dialogue. Enough for me, and I hand the microphone over to Jesper.
Thank you.
For those who couldn't see, we were literally handing the microphone over.
It was in 1993, as a visiting research student at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, that for the first time I read a passage in the rabbinical text Midrash Tanhuma, a text that has influenced me profoundly. The passage begins with a discussion about the differences between the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, but often in a wider sense the entire Hebrew Bible, and the Jewish oral traditions known as the Oral Torah. And then follows a Midrash, in which it is suggested that Moses also wanted the Mishnah, which is the oldest part of the Oral Torah, in writing. However, God refused, because God foresaw that the peoples of the world were going to translate the Torah and read it in Greek, and then they would say, Anu hen Israel, we are Israel. God therefore wanted the Mishnah to be a secret, sod, because there are those who will use the Jewish Holy Scriptures as a theological weapon aimed at the Jewish people. Now, this is clearly a reference to the claim of the Christian movement, and as a matter of fact, numerous Christians take for granted that this is the Christian position, i.e., that Christians must claim that they are the true Israel, they are the new Israel, or quite simply Israel, at the expense of the self-understanding of the Jewish people. Jews have been targeted by numerous anti-Jewish ideologies throughout the ages. But only Christendom has claimed that it has replaced Israel, that the biblical texts actually are about Christians, and that in fact these texts can only be read with Christian glasses. In other words, Christians have developed a hermeneutics that has not only decentered, but also disinherited Jews and Judaism. One of the biblical texts most often referred to in discussions about how Christians ought to think of Christianity in relation to Judaism is known as the letter to the Hebrews. There is no single text in the New Testament that to a greater degree than Hebrews has cemented the notion that it is fundamental to Christian faith that Judaism and Christianity can and should be described as 2 covenants, and that the new covenant is better than the previous one. It's perhaps not surprising. After all, the Greek word diatheke, which means covenant, occurs 33 times in the New Testament, 14 of which in Hebrews alone. In other words, Almost half of all the occurrences are found in this single text. And the word kraton, meaning better, occurs 19 times in the New Testament, out of which 13 in Hebrews alone. So if this text is a comparison between Christianity and Judaism, is it then so far-fetched to draw the conclusion that Christianity is a better religion than Judaism? Does it not explicitly state in chapter 8, verse 13, that in speaking of a new covenant, God has made the first one obsolete? And what is obsolete and growing old will soon disappear. So, how on earth are we to interpret Hebrews? How should ministers preach Hebrews responsibly and well? That's our key question today in this Zoom lecture, the third in our spring series. In an article published in First Things 2019, Jewish scholar David Novak defines supersessionism as, quote, the theological conviction that the Christian church has superseded the Jewish people, assuming the role as God's covenanted people, Israel, end of quote. Or in the words of Midrash Tanhuma, Ano hen Israel, we are Israel. Hence, supersessionism is the understanding that Judaism is not so much a different religion from Christianity, but that in terms of chronology and quality, it could and it should be described as a prologue to Christianity. In history, it is argued Judaism preceded Christianity. It belongs to the past. And theologically, Christianity should proceed in the future without Judaism. Judaism paved the way for Christianity, and it should also make way for Christianity. This way of thinking has been extraordinarily influential in Christian theology. However, we are many who seek other ways to describe the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and we are convinced that the biblical text provides us with an earlier and less traveled by way of relating the two religious traditions to each other. Hence, many of the questions that we pose are old as is the Christian tradition itself. And some of the answers that we articulate are new, and they make it possible for us to read the text in such a way that the inherent Jewishness of the early Christian movement is taken into consideration to much a higher extent than only a couple of decades ago. Both the historical Jesus and the historical Paul are now firmly situated in late Second Temple Judaism. And the post-70 CE writers of the New Testament form their theology and write their text in the wake of the destruction of the temple, when all branches of Judaism had to cope with the fact that the sanctuary was no more. So when a growing number of scholars currently read the New Testament, Judaism is not portrayed as the gloomy background from which Christianity had to be removed in order to glow and to grow. On the contrary, it is to the Jewish matrix one must return in order to appreciate the New Testament text more fully. In this endeavor to uncover early Christian hermeneutics, that is non-supersessionist, Hebrew seems to be one of few exceptions. Most scholars, people in the pulpit and in the pew, they all seem to take for granted that Hebrews is a supersessionist text, that is, so to speak, it's the letter against the Hebrews, hence the title for this lecture today. As a matter of fact, those who are involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue often choose as their starting point Romans 11, as does Nostra Aetate, for example, the Roman Catholic document from 1965 from the Second Vatican Council on interreligious relations. And those who are less interested in finding ways not to delegitimize Jewish tradition often point to a couple of passages in Hebrews. In an article published in 2015, I call this way of dividing the sources into two groups, the good text, bad text hermeneutics, as in the expression good cop, bad cop in some of the police series we see it sometimes. We seem to take for granted that Hebrews is a problematic text for those involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue, and it is an asset for those who see it as a dangerous enterprise, hence good text, bad text hermeneutics. But in my opinion, it would be strange if such an early text, reasonably from the time around the fall of the Second Temple, 70 CE, if such an early text expressed a programmatic and problematic supersessionist theology that came to be developed only later, when it was possible to consider and describe Judaism and Christianity as two sharply defined religions. The question is, have we sufficiently reflected on the fact that this is a text written before they were perceived as two different religious systems? To give an example from the 20th century, and this is an example I used in a previous lecture in this series, it would be anachronistic to call the war that broke out in 1914 the First World War, until there was a Second World War 25 years later. And I'm inclined to argue that it's also anachronistic to talk about Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religions, as two covenants, when Hebrew was written. I believe that the reason for reading this text timelessly, by which I mean anachronistically, is that we know so little about its historical context. Many think that Hebrews originally was a sermon, noteworthy for its elegant Greek and rhetoric, that eventually was edited in order to fit the format of an epistle. Hence, we can only conjure by whom, to whom, when, where, and why it was written. Origen, Christian writer, famously stated that, quote, "Who wrote the epistle, in truth, only God knows," unquote. And New Testament handbooks tend to end up with suggesting that it was probably written between 60 and 120 CE, and that it has something to do with Italy, because there is a greeting in chapter 13, verse 24. But that's all. Probably written between 1620 and having something to do with Italy. So this lack of historical knowledge, that there is a minimum of historical knowledge, has probably contributed to the mainstream interpretation, that the text is the first example of the Christian supersessionism that later would determine so much of Jewish-Christian relations. In other words, it's more often presented as the first volume in Christian dogmatics than one of the most enigmatic New Testament texts. So what about the word covenant, the atheke in Hebrews? Christians are so used to referring to the Jewish Bible as the Old Testament and Judaism as the Old Covenant that they might not be able to see what the author here actually has in view. At the time of the composition of Hebrews, the Old Covenant could not be a technical term for Judaism. It's crucial to note that the New Covenant for the anonymous author of Hebrews, above all, belongs to the future. It belongs to the future. In other words, Hebrews is thus far more eschatological than most biblical scholars and numerous readers of the Bible have realized and taken into consideration. Now, this is not far-fetched. If both the oldest letters in the New Testament written by Paul and the oldest Gospels in the New Testament, the synoptic tradition, are eschatological, then why should not the oldest preserved Christian sermon, i.e. Hebrews, also be eschatological, in the sense that it is future-oriented and assumes that the end of the world is imminent? Hebrews presupposes the dialectics between the present and the future. We now live in, quote, the time that is, eiston kairon ton enestekota, Hebrews 9:9. And the author longs for the time for a better order, mechri kairo diorthosios epikeimena, Hebrews 9:10. And note here that the key word is kairos, time. The heavenly service in which Jesus Christ serves as high priest is already in progress, which is invisible to human eyes, it's inaudible to human ears, it's incomprehensible to human thoughts. But the time of the new era has not yet completely broken. In the words of Peter J. Thompson in this book, If This Be From Heaven, Jesus and the New Testament Authors in Their Relationship to Judaism, he writes, quote, "The new covenant, if we may accentuate it, is valid only in heaven, not yet upon earth. The good things of which Christ is the direct image are yet to come. They are yet to come," end of quote. It's also crucial to note how the verb palaion, to grow old, is used. This verb occurs 3 times in the New Testament, once in the Gospel of Luke and twice in Hebrews. The Lucan Jesus encourages in 12:33 his disciples to sell what they have and give alms so that they provide themselves with money bags that do not grow old. Me palaiumena, money bags that do not grow old, which is a treasure in the heavens that does not fail to do as the earthly goods. Hence, in Luke, this verb is set in a comparison between earthly possessions that are perishable and the heavenly treasure that never grows old. So we see here heaven and earth. The first chapter of Hebrews, verses 10, 11, 12, quotes Psalms 102, which praises God for the creation, which although breathtakingly splendid, yet one day will perish. It will wear out. It will wear out like clothing. The verb is used to describe the frangibility and limitations of this world. And now the third text, Hebrew 8:13, where it is anticipated that the old covenant will soon disappear, engis aphenismu. It will soon disappear. Now, my question is not the most plausible interpretation that the author here, too, as in chapter 1, articulates the belief that one day this world will grow old and only God will remain? If yes, then this verse is an expression of an intense eschatological longing for the future, for a complete and perfected world. And if yes, is it not a tragic irony that so many Christians invert the meaning in these two passages in Hebrews and interpret it as though God actually changes, that God prefers new religion to old religion, wishing that the latter soon disappears? This is, as a matter of fact, the opposite message compared to Hebrews 1:11. Easy to remember, 1:1:1. Hebrews 1:11, where it says, "But you, God, are the same, and your years will never end." As I've already accentuated, it would thus be anachronistic to assume that what is compared in Hebrews is Christianity and Judaism at a time when they were not yet regarded as autonomous religions. It is not Christianity in the present and Judaism in the past that the author compares. Instead, it's the future and perfect that are compared to the earthly and fragmentary. In short, what is being compared is heaven and earth, and the author of Hebrews states, not surprisingly, for Neoplatonists, that the heavenly is perfect and the earthly is deficient. I assume that most of the following verses are well known to many of you, but this time, just listen to what they inform us about the author's understanding of the tension between already now and not yet. 9:24. For Christ did not enter a sanctuary made by human hands, a mere copy of the true one, but he entered into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. 9:26. He has appeared once and for all at the end of the age. 10:24-25. Let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but instead encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Blepete engisosan ten hemeran. That you see that the day is approaching. And 11, in the list, there is a list of ancestors who have faith, and faith is here defined by the author as the insurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Quote, they confessed that they were strangers and foreigners on earth, for people who speak in this way make clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of the land that they had left behind, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desired a better country, that is, a heavenly one. A heavenly one. And 13:14, the very famous verse, for here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Now, when I read all these passages in Hebrews, I cannot see that the conclusion is that it's better to give thanks to the God of Israel in churches and cathedrals made with human hands than in synagogues also built with human hands. Au contraire, The author of Hebrews confesses that the new is better than the old because the kingdom of heaven is better than earthly life. In the words of Clark Williamson and Ronald Allen in this book, published as early as 1989, Interpreting Difficult Text, Anti-Judaism and Christian Preaching, they write, "Heaven is a place of perfection, which in this sermon refers to immediate access to God. To be perfected is to be in the full immediate presence of God, and the earth is the realm of imperfection in which access to God is partial and available only through intermediaries." End of quote. Hence, I think that Hebrew 8:13 neither is a prediction of the fall of the temple, if written before 70 CE, nor gives vent to a theological schadenfreude, if written post 70 CE. But I do believe that it articulates a profoundly eschatological expectation. The message in Hebrews is hardly that Christian services are better than those who take place in synagogues, but that celestial service is heavenly compared to earthly, more or less mundane services. This line of thought is presented in more detail in a chapter in this book that I co-edited 10 years ago. I believe it's 10 years now, together with Philip Cunningham, Joseph Sievers, Mary Boyce, and Hans Hermann Hendricks. Christ Jesus and the Jewish people today, new explorations of theological interrelationships. And as a matter of fact, this interpretation of Hebrews has become relatively influential, as shown by the 18th paragraph in a Roman Catholic document from 2015, is called "The Gifts and the Callings of God are Irrevocable," which is a quotation from Romans 11:29, and also the cornerstone on the 4th paragraph of Nostra Aetate. And this is what it says in the 2015 document about Hebrews. The issue in the Epistle to the Hebrews is not the contrast of the Old and New Covenant as we understand them today, nor a contrast between Church and Judaism. Rather, the contrast is between the eternal heavenly priesthood of Christ and the transitory earthly priesthood. End of quote. In other words, I argue that the comparative paradigm, the new and better, that has governed so much of Jewish-Christian relationships is based on a flawed reading of Hebrews, which fails to take into consideration the role of early Christian apocalypticism when interpreting this text. All of the above leads to 3 recommendations that I hope will help us read Hebrews responsibly and well in the future. This is my first recommendation. We need to rediscover the pilgrimage motif in the Bible in general and in Hebrews in particular. We need to rediscover the pilgrimage motif in the Bible in general and in Hebrews in particular. Christians that look upon themselves as pilgrims are reminded that they have not yet reached their destination, they are still on their way, and that they do not have all the answers. One famous example of peregrinatio is, of course, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, a work which is dependent on the theology of Hebrews. Another example is Eerdmans Das Wandernde Gottesvolk, written while he was in prison in 1937 for insubordination. He had given a sermon on Isaiah 26:13, where it says, "O Lord our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but we acknowledge your name alone." End of quote. And for this, he was put in prison. He argues that pilgrimage is the principal motif in Hebrews. He writes, quote, "The form of existence in time appropriate to the recipient of the revelation can only be that of wandering." And he ends his book with the statement that all the utterances in Hebrew take the basis from the motif of the wandering people of God. End of quote. And the third example is the article published in 1978, The Pilgrimage Motif in the Book of Hebrews, written by William G. Johnson. My second recommendation is it's important to read Hebrews holistically. It's important to read Hebrews holistically. It seems reasonable to argue that the author of Hebrews is no less eschatological in chapters 8 and 9 than in chapters 11, 12, and 13. And we often read the concluding chapters of Hebrews eschatologically forward-oriented. In my native Sweden, hymns sung at funerals often include theology and sometimes even quotations from Hebrew. And one particularly forward-looking verse is 13:14. I already quoted this. Here we have no lasting city, but we are looking for the city that is to come. Tenmelusan, Pollin. And this is also the perspective in chapter 11, verse 16. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. God has prepared a city for them. It's my distinct impression that whereas chapter 8 is often read with a polemical agenda, vis-a-vis the Jewish tradition, other chapters are read in a parenetical context, for example, at funerals, and this should give us pause. And now the third recommendation, take note of what it is that is being compared in Hebrews. Take note of what it is that is being compared in Hebrews. There is certainly a comparison in this sermonic epistle, and one is better, Kraton, than the other. But it is not Judaism and Christianity that the author compares. And as I've underlined repeatedly in this lecture, it is simply anachronistic to require that first century Christians were able to refer to Judaism and Christianity as two distinct religious traditions, one belonging to the past, i.e. Judaism, and one here and now, Christianity. Judaism and Christianity. Instead, the comparison is not between past and present, but between present and perfect. The comparison is between what is now and what one day shall be. And not only staunch Platonists, such as the author of Hebrews, hopes that the heavenly service is somewhat better than the ones on earth. A related problem is that we tend to compare our own words to the other's world, our own words to the other's worlds, our ideals and their reality. Harvard professor, Swedish Bishop Krister Stendahl famously offered 3 rules for improved interreligious relations. Many of you have heard this before. 2 of them were, let the others define themselves and leave room for holy envy. And the 3rd rule was compare equal to equal. We must always compare our ideal to the other's ideal and our reality to the other's reality. Or to use the words that I used before, not our words and the other worlds, but words and words and world and world. Needless to say, an eschatological reading of the Epistle to Hebrews does not answer all questions. Rather, it adds a new question. How on earth are we to read the text? And that the answer I try to give here in this lecture is that on earth, we should read it as we read eschatological statements in the Pauline epistles. Paul too thought that the end of the world was imminent. He wrote in Romans 13:11, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near. This is something he wrote perhaps years 57 C, not 1957, but 57. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. The night is far gone, the day is near, i.e. the day of the Lord. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10:11, he writes about the text, they were written down to instruct us on whom the ends of the ages have come. So he too thought that he belonged to the last generation, or possibly generations. He too longed to depart and to be with Christ, for that was far better. Pologar malon kreison. This is far better. You see the same word in Paul here, kreison. On the other hand, the other texts in the New Testament all emphasize that something and some things had already happened. In the Pauline epistles, we read about the ingathering of the Gentiles, that they too are now covenantally embraced by the God of Israel. And in the synoptic tradition, we encounter numerous texts that proclaim that the kingdom of God is at hand. And in the 4th gospel, we find the influential theological line of thought that the presence of God is manifest in Jesus Christ. The Shekhinah of God tented Eskenosen in him, John writes in his prologue. Interestingly enough, These are examples of exceptionally few Hebrew and Greek words that seems to be etymologically connected. Shachan in Hebrew, skenun in Greek both mean to tempt. And I ask, is it not worth pondering that the words for the divine presence in our world is arguably the strongest link between the two parts of the Christian Bible? Reading Hebrews eschatologically provides us with a hermeneutical framework when interpreting it. When listening to the voice of Hebrews without presupposing supersessionism belonging to later generations of Christ believers, we hear in the oldest Christian sermon that has been preserved for posterity what we already are familiar with when listening to Paul and other voices in the New Testament choir, a yearning for a world that is better, kraton, than this world. In one word, this is how we should read Hebrews on earth. By way of conclusion, my thought returned to the Midrash I read for the first time some 30 years ago in Jerusalem. In that Midrash, I became acquainted with the Jewish perspective on Christians' triumphalistic claim that God has abandoned the Jewish people and that the church now is Israel, Anohen Yisrael. It is a fact that this is how many Christians have looked upon themselves vis-à-vis the Jewish people, and Hebrews has more often than not been referred to in this self-aggrandizing agenda. But when we start reading Hebrews as an eschatological text, written by a person on earth longing for the eschaton, a new scenario may be set before our eyes. And I would therefore like to suggest an alternative ending of the Midrash, based on the words in Zechariah 8:23, which describes a kind of eschatological, universal, Gentile minyan, where the key word is imachem, with you. Quote, thus says the Lord of hosts, in those days 10 men from nations of every language shall take hold of a Jew, grasping his garment and saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Nelcha imachem ki shamanu Elohim imachem. Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jesper. And I would like to invite, most of our audience is on Zoom. We have 55 people on Zoom and a few in the room. So people on Zoom, please write your questions in the chat. It's actually quite complicated for us to have you give the question in person. So I suppose need be, it must be arranged. But we would very much like to hear questions from you. In the meantime, we're waiting for you to do that. Let me just return to the title of the talk. So you asked, you said, you called it Epistle to the Hebrews or against them. And I understand your argument back against the second option, against the Hebrews. But what does it mean then for this to be an epistle to the Hebrews?
So thank you. So I think it's not, as you said, an epistle against the Hebrews, because that is not what is being compared in this text. And presumably it's not even to the Hebrews, but it's for a better world. It's a cri de coeur, perhaps for a persecuted group. And that's why I think of it's not comparing something in the past and present, but comparing present to future.
So the to the Hebrews is just a happenstance title, essentially.
Yes.
Do we have questions? Looks like you stumped the audience.
So just to be sure that I don't say that I'm the first to present this line of thought, because I'm certainly not, and I referred to a couple of other books. I even showed them to you. But what I found so interesting is that this project of ours Christ Jesus and the Jewish people today, that was published with a foreword by Walter Cardinal Casper. That seemed to be the starting point for the reflections in this document from 2015. So I'm happy to see that a scholarly book had that impact.
We do have one hand up from Eva Karen Schoenbeck, but we can try if you want to open your audio so we can hear it on your computer, and the rest of us will be muted.
Okay, so and it won't be a problem with that one.
No, it shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
Should I try? Can you hear me?
Hey, Eva Karin.
Hey, Jesper. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Is it not working?
We're not hearing.
Yes, I hear you, Eva.
Okay, we do have a question.
Yeah, I can hear it. So
No, I'm afraid we can't hear you. So if it,
Put it in
may
the
we
chat.
ask you to write it in the chat, and then we'll be happy to answer the question.
Now we have some questions. So Jonathan Watson asked, will a bibliography of the available books and articles mentioned? I think that's probably simple to do.
Pardon, I couldn't hear that.
Whether you could make a bibliography available of all the books and articles that you've mentioned.
I'd be happy to do that.
That would
Yeah.
be easy to do. Then we have a question from Margaret Shepherd. Could you please say more about Peter Thompson's book?
I'd be happy to do that. As I said, it's a book called If This Be From Heaven, Jesus and the New Testament Authors in Their Relationship to Judaism. So it is it's a presentation of almost the entire New Testament with short essays on the various chapters and the implications for how Christians looked upon, Christ believers looked upon the Jewish traditions in antiquity, and the implications for Christians today. So I think it's an excellent book. Might be out of print, I do not know. It was published in 2001. I often used it as a course book when I gave courses in Jerusalem. It was very helpful, I would say.
Vicky Simmons asks, what's the difference among
What is the difference among the terms
This-
Hebrews,
this-
Israelites, Jews? So if we had been panim el panim, vis-a-vis, face to face, it would be easier for me to understand if you mean in this particular text or in the New Testament, or as Jews and Christians use the words, because they are used in various ways. This series of lecture had one presentation on the synoptic tradition and one on Paul, and now on Hebrews, but not so much on John. So I think that we haven't talked about John so much in this series. So John has this particular way of using the word that we translate as Jews, Judaios in Greek, Judaioi in the plural, and he uses it in a particular and almost peculiar way. So Israelite for him is a positive word. We see that in chapter 1 in John, but almost all the 70 examples of Judaioi is in a negative context. So therefore, I usually think of it as a rhetorical term. It is something that rhetorically you use it because it's the other that is there in the Johannine context somehow. So therefore, for John, Israelite is a positive word and Jew is a negative. Jew is used seldom in the New Testament. It's actually only in Acts and in John that we find it. There are 16 examples in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Almost most of them refer to the titulus, the inscription on the cross that the Romans wrote. So it's a word that the Romans used, which is interesting. Hebrews is a secondary title, if that's the word in English. It's not, as you said, original. Probably this is a sermon, as I said, that has been epistolized. It became an epistle. So therefore, we don't know so much about that. So those are few reflections about Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. And the fourth word, of course, would be Israel per se.
Stephen Shore asks, what do you make of the fact that the Eucharist isn't mentioned in Hebrews as the successor to temple sacrifice?
I think it's so interesting to read Hebrews, as I did past Good Friday here, from beginning to the end, and think of it as a pre-70 document, and then reread it and think of it as a post-70 document, and to see the difference. Because there's one sentence that's so interesting, where it says that otherwise there seemed to be a reference to the temple, that the sacrifices and the services are still going on. And if it is a post-70 document, it would be odd to do it. Perhaps he was thinking that it will soon be rebuilt. The first temple was rebuilt, perhaps not soon, but it was rebuilt. So maybe that was what people thought for the first years. And we even know that Roman emperor wanted to bash the Christians by favoring the Jews. So he wanted to rebuild the temple. And when he died prematurely, the Christians thought that it's 1-0 to us. So the temple, the rebuilding of the temple was there certainly in the first and second century. And the question now was what about the sacrifices in the Eucharist? So that there is, in the old times before we had cellular phones, we used cameras, and you remember sometimes a camera could have a problem that it didn't switch to the next picture, so there were two at the same time. I guess if younger people attending this lecture, they don't have an idea what I'm talking about, but those of us who are a bit older, we know what this is. So it was a double exposure, and that's very much, I believe, what we have in Hebrew. So there are references to the earthly service, and there are references to the heavenly. So it's both, if I may do a cross here, it's both a temporal issue now and in the future, and heaven and earth. And it oscillates between these two dimensions. That's my impression when reading Hebrews. But I recommend you to do that, what I did on Good Friday, to read it twice and always think of it. This is before 70, the temple is there, sacrifices, service is there. And the second one, Churban Habayit, is a fact, the destruction of the temple. And what are we to do with that? We are living now in the wake of this destruction.
Thank you. And now we do have a question from Eva Karin, Schoenbeck. I was curious about the reactions that Dr. Svartvik had lately on this approach, although it is, as he says, not entirely new in the scholarly world. The eschatological age of the times then, in the first century CE, seems to be more evident nowadays in research. Your comment, please? Is this an example of another eschatologically related historical issue that is still being neglected?
So the eschatological age of the times then seems to be more evident nowadays in research. So for example, that we read the Pauline epistles with this eschatological horizon, if that's a good word, and certainly we do. Albert Schweitzer, he insisted on this very much. He took it all the way back to the historical Jesus, but certainly we have it in the synoptic tradition, and we have it in Paul, no doubt about it. And we also have it in the Gospels presentation of John the Baptist. So John was eschatological, the synoptic tradition is it, Paul is it, so why not Hebrews as well?
AJ Levine has a series of questions here. So she said, thank you for this talk. Could you speak to A, restriction of foreigners a forgiveness of sins to blood, Hebrews 9:22. Well, we stop with there and then we'll get the other part of the question.
Okay, so there are two questions here. So in Hebrews 9:22, there is a reference to the connection between forgiveness and blood. If you give me a few seconds. And it says katatonomon. Right. So it says according to the law. I mean, Torah, or the theology in the Torah, or the text in the Torah, there is a connection between forgiveness and blood. And I was very much influenced by a book. We had a book presentation here, I believe. I can't recall now, maybe in October, of my latest book in English on reconciliation and transformation. And I referred to this book now, written by someone who belongs to a pacifist line of thought in the Christian tradition. And when reading this text in that context, it's not so much that there is a necessary connection, that blood is a necessary condition for forgiveness, but this, what did I say? Almost everything according to the Torah. So it's not that there has to be blood in order to the forgiveness, but God forgives because God is God. And in order for people to understand that, claim that, to take that, to make that conviction their own, they did what people did in antiquity, and there were sacrifices. But if you were poor and you couldn't sacrifice an animal, you could bring forth a very small, almost symbolical offering, and that sacrifice, that offering, would be keilu, as if it were the other. So it's not a kind of logical connection between forgiveness and blood, but more of a, I'm looking for the English word here, but that's usually, as I said, the Greek schedon katatonomon. It's regularly so, but it's not necessarily so. So that was a few reflections on the first question. And then we have a second one.
Right, so let me read that. So the second is the question of whether anti-Zionist interpretation, whether you could comment on anti-Zionist interpretations of Hebrews, in the sense that Jews do not have a homeland in the present, and this is part of the denationalization of Christian discourse until Constantine.
So Hebrews plays a role, but my impression when I lived in Jerusalem for 10 years, but it didn't play the major role. It was more that you can't read the Bible halfway. I often heard from people saying that if you read the Hebrew Bible, the so-called Old Testament, you have to continue into the New Testament, and there you see that the promises are fulfilled, and it's not so much about land as it is about spirituality. So I'm sure that Hebrew has played a role here, but since Hebrews places everyone, the tag on every person is pilgrim, not only the evige Jude, the wandering Jew, but everyone. So therefore, for me, it's a bit more difficult for a very hardcore anti-Zionist interpretation of the Bible to emphasize Hebrews, because anything that talks about that anyone has the right to live anywhere, that would be a very mundane interpretation of the scriptures, as I see Hebrews.
And there's a question coming in from Sam Jai. It keeps changing every time I look at it. So just speaking, it's not in the chat. Speaking of eschatology and of distinguishing Christian and Jewish theologies and languages, even when we talk about the eschatology of Hebrews, of the first century Jews, as opposed to later Christian supersessionist eschatology, it is still difficult for Christians today to refrain from reading this into their own eschatology. Do you have one suggestion of an example that would help us to more accurately understand it's Hebrews' own eschatology?
If I have an example of that?
Yeah.
So I brought a lot of books here today, and let me show you another one. There's an interesting conversation in this book, the Epistle to the Hebrews and Christian Theology. It's in a series from Eerdmans. I think there's one on Genesis and one on John, perhaps even more. And there's a very interesting conversation between Richard Hayes, who quotes an immature scholar, and when you look at the footnote, you see that it's Richard Hayes that he's referring to, so it's superseding its own supersessionism. And then there's a response by the Norwegian scholar Oscar Skarsauner, and also by Mark Nainus and Nehemiah Pollen. So I recommend all of you who are interested in this topic to read that, especially Richard Hayes' article, and see how the argument develops there.
Can you give us insights into that?
He says that it's a self-consuming artifact, that there's this expression in Hebrews about the fire that consumes everything. So if you have a peregrinatio theology, if you are on your way, then you realize that everyone is on the way, and you can never say that I have reached the goal, because that's we are all pilgrims. Another book, this is especially for students, but it's interesting for everyone. Reading the Epistle to the Hebrews, a resource for students, and they have, if I remember correctly, an article, right? The Sacrifice of Praise, Does Hebrews Promote Supersessionism, by Alan Mitchell, and I enjoyed reading that as well. So those are a few books and few articles that are very interesting.
Okay. Jennifer Zoller is asking, can we please write the book name in the chat? But maybe we will send a full bibliography of everything you've mentioned.
That we will do.
To everybody who's registered on Zoom and here in person also, obviously. So that will be make things easier for everybody. I don't see other questions here. So do you have last words you'd like to share? You've said them.
I'm very happy for having this opportunity to give this series of lecture this spring. This is also my last of 4th semesters here at Boston College, so I'd like to thank my colleagues Ruth Langer and Camille Markey very much for very, very stimulating cooperation for the last 4 semesters and last semester here in Boston. And
we want to thank you very much also for all of the richness that you brought to our conversations, both these lunchtime seminars, these 3, but also the Corcoran Chair conference that was, it seems like last week, but it was closer to a month ago, 3 weeks ago, something like that. That the videos for that will still be made available. They're still being processed. Plus the Corcoran Chair conference from last year, where the materials are available online. So there's, and the various other events during this year and last year that, because thanks to our having been forced onto Zoom, we can make available in perpetuity to our community of discourse. So we want to thank you very, very much, Jesper, for all that you have brought to us and all that you have taught us over these last couple of years. And actually, there will be one more event on next Monday, which will be actually your students from the class here interviewing James Carroll about 20 years after his blockbuster of a book, like
Constantine's
Sword, and what has changed, what's different in the world of Jewish-Christian relations in the last 20 years. So thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing all of our audience. We will invite you to events in the future as they become planned. There is actually one last question coming in from Judy. Thank you. Do you see any validity to the argument that one reason for Christianity's claim is that it was the new Israel, claimed that it was the new Israel and had superseded or replaced the old Israel, is that the Israelite faith was considered a licit religion by the Roman Empire and usually tolerated, while the other religions were persecuted. By claiming the credentials of Israelite faith, Christians were protecting themselves against persecution.
The short answer is yes. I think that's very, very central. We sometimes think of theology as words and lofty thoughts and that belong in Plato's heaven. But this is down to earth. This is what it was all about in the Roman Empire. That Judaism was a religion that was allowed, accepted, recognized. That the Roman authorities realized that they couldn't force Jews to worship Caesar. So therefore, they didn't have to, but it was an exception. And then along came this group of people who read Genesis and Jeremiah, and but were not members of the Jewish people. So who were they? And certainly some said, we have been somehow grafted into the Jewish people, so we have converted into, not only converted to the Jewish religion, faith, but also we are there as a Jewish people, and we have their language. We say Abba and Amen and other Hebrew Aramaic words that we have in the New Testament. But Paul seems to insist that they remain what Paula Fredrickson calls ex-pagan pagans, that they are no longer pagans, but they are not members of the Jewish nation, Jewish people. And therefore, it was very difficult. That seems to be the context in Galatians, I believe. It was very difficult. They were very vulnerable, that they were no longer pagans, but they were not Jews. They were not part of, they were not Bnei Israel, members of they were not Israelites, if you can use that expression. So what were they? And they were, as I said, vulnerable, fragile, and were they to sacrifice to the emperor and therefore not being loyal to the God of Israel? Or should they desist? And there were persecution for this. So thank you, Judith, as always. That's a very important question. I also think that this fiscus judaicus, that the special Jew tax that was due for them to pay, that also made it more obvious that the Gentile Christians had to decide, are we Jews or are we Gentiles who believe in the Jewish God, the God of Israel? What are we to do? So as these are times for tax filing in America, in Sweden, so the fiscus judaicus is another litmus test. What does it mean to be a Christ believer in antiquity? So thank you once again.
That was a timely question and a timely answer, given that in Massachusetts taxes are due today, thanks to Victory Day yesterday. And so on behalf of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning, on behalf of Camille Markey, our Associate Director, I want to again extend my thanks and look forward to seeing all of you down the road.